Have you ever found yourself completely exhausted from constantly explaining yourself, desperately arguing with toxic people who are deeply committed to misunderstanding you, only to realize that your emotional reactions are exactly what gives them ultimate power over you? We are falsely taught that we must loudly defend our character against every single unfair accusation. But the brutal psychological reality is that your desperate need to be right is the exact weakness that manipulators actively use to completely control your mind. Before we dive into today's life-changing lesson on the terrifying, undeniable power of absolute silence, please take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you these powerful stories. In the highly competitive, ruthless trading district of a massive ancient city, there lived a brilliant, incredibly hard-working young strategist named Orion, who simply could not control his explosive emotions. Orion possessed an absolute genius-level intellect, consistently designing the most profitable trade routes in the entire empire. But he was completely paralyzed by a desperate, toxic need for everyone's constant approval and validation. Whenever a lazy rival merchant or an arrogant noble questioned his brilliant work, Orion would immediately become highly defensive, aggressively raising his voice, pacing around the room and fiercely explaining his logic until his throat was completely raw. He foolishly believed that if he just provided enough loud, logical evidence, his incredibly toxic critics would eventually apologize, suddenly respect his massive intelligence, and finally admit that he was completely right all along. But human psychology is deeply ruthless, and his biggest rival, an arrogant, highly manipulative man named Vane, quickly realized that Orion's explosive emotional reactions were an incredibly easy weapon to actively use against him. During the most important council meeting of the entire decade, Vane stood up in front of the wealthy royal investors and intentionally, loudly mocked Orion's latest design, calling it the completely pathetic work of an amateur child. Exactly as predicted, Orion violently took the bait, jumping out of his heavy chair with a bright red face, frantically screaming about his long hours of research and desperately begging the investors to look at his detailed, perfect charts. But as Orion wildly shouted and aggressively waved his arms in the air, Vane simply stood there with a calm, arrogant smirk, completely silent, happily watching the brilliant young strategist completely humiliate himself in front of the kingdom's most powerful men. The wealthy investors did not care about Orion's brilliant math or his undeniable logic. They only saw a highly unstable, emotionally fragile young man who was entirely too weak to handle basic, low-level criticism, and they immediately gave the massive, life-changing contract to Vane instead. Completely crushed, deeply embarrassed, and utterly defeated, Orion walked out into the freezing night rain, severely cursing his own explosive temper, and wondering why his massive intelligence was constantly being overshadowed by arrogant manipulators. From the dark shadows of an empty tavern doorway, an old, legendary diplomat named Balthasar, a man who had famously negotiated the end of massive global wars without ever once raising his voice, slowly stepped into the rain and looked directly at the broken young man. You brilliantly understand the complex mathematics of the entire global market, Orion, but you are a complete, pathetic amateur when it comes to the dark, ruthless psychology of human dominance, the old diplomat said with a terrifyingly calm, heavy voice. Balthasar explained that a manipulator like Vane does not actually care about the truth of the argument. He is simply throwing a cheap emotional hook into the dark water, actively hunting for the massive, explosive reaction that proves he entirely controls your mind. When you frantically yell, fiercely defend yourself, and desperately over-explain your position, you are actively handing the manipulator the absolute crown of authority, screaming to the entire room that you deeply value his toxic, worthless opinion. Silence is not an incredibly weak surrender. Absolute, unflinching silence is a terrifying psychological vacuum that forcefully, violently sucks all of the power out of the room and instantly places it directly into your own calm hands. The old diplomat instructed Orion to return to the Royal Council the very next week, completely strip his face of all visible emotion, and absolutely refuse to feed the starving, desperate egos of the men who were actively trying to publicly destroy him. Orion spent the next 7 days aggressively training his own mind, staring into a cold mirror for hours, violently killing his desperate need to be understood, and completely mastering the terrifying, heavily intimidating art of the dead, emotionless stare. When the Royal Council finally reconvened, Orion walked into the grand, highly decorated hall with a completely different aura, radiating a dark, heavy, untouchable confidence that immediately made the entire room feel incredibly uncomfortable. Desperate to easily recreate his previous victory, Vane immediately stood up, puffed out his chest, and aggressively threw a cruel, highly calculated insult directly at Orion's new proposal, loudly waiting for the young man's usual explosive mental breakdown. But Orion did not jump up, he did not turn red, and he absolutely did not open his mouth to desperately defend his brilliant, flawless work against a man who possessed half of his actual intelligence. Instead, Orion slowly leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, perfectly locked his cold, unblinking eyes directly onto Vane's face, and allowed a completely deafening, suffocating silence to heavily fill the massive stone room. 5 agonizing seconds passed, then 10, then 15. The heavy, unbearable silence completely amplified Vane's childish insult, making it hang awkwardly in the air until it sounded incredibly stupid, deeply petty, and entirely unprofessional to everyone listening. Because Orion absolutely refused to give him the explosive emotional reaction he desperately needed to survive, Vane suddenly began to deeply panic, nervously shifting his weight, awkwardly clearing his throat, and frantically trying to explain his own bad joke. As Vane continued to anxiously stammer and backtrack, completely unraveling under the crushing, heavy weight of Orion's cold, unflinching stare, the wealthy investors watched in absolute disgust at Vane's sudden, pathetic display of supreme weakness. Without saying a single word in his own defense, Orion completely destroyed his biggest enemy, instantly reclaiming his massive power and forcing the entire Royal Council to finally treat him with the ultimate, profound respect he truly deserved. This incredibly powerful, dark psychological story holds an absolutely urgent, life-altering truth for anyone who is constantly drained by narcissistic family members, highly toxic coworkers, or manipulative friends who love to intentionally push your emotional buttons. You must fundamentally understand that your desperate, frantic reaction is the absolute only currency that a toxic manipulator accepts, and when you finally ruthlessly cut off their emotional funding, they will completely starve to death in front of your eyes. Over-explaining your personal boundaries to someone who is actively committed to deeply misunderstanding you is an incredibly tragic waste of your premium energy and a massive, flashing sign of deep internal insecurity? The exact moment you boldly stop, desperately caring what highly flawed, deeply unhappy people think about your personal life is the exact moment you become completely untouchable, highly dangerous, and entirely invincible in this noisy world. When someone openly disrespects you, insulting your intelligence or violently crossing your firm boundaries, do not instantly reward their toxic behavior by eagerly giving them a front-row ticket to your highly expensive premium emotional energy. Instead, immediately give them the terrifying, heavy gift of your absolute absence, looking right through them with a cold, unbothered stare that silently communicates they are completely unworthy of a single second of your precious time. True, undeniable power is perfectly knowing that you could absolutely destroy someone in a loud, vicious argument, but actively choosing to simply walk away because their pathetic, low-level existence simply does not deserve your brilliant, highly elevated focus. When you finally master the incredible art of moving in complete, absolute silence, you instantly become a massive, terrifying mystery to the exact people who previously thought they had you perfectly figured out and completely controlled. They will aggressively try to provoke you, they will wildly spread desperate rumors, and they will dramatically play the victim. But your total lack of reaction will eventually completely expose their own toxic madness to the entire observing world. Stop freely handing out your incredibly expensive attention to absolutely everyone who asks for it, and fiercely protect your inner peace like a heavily guarded, impenetrable vault containing the world's most priceless, beautiful diamonds. Your absolute silence is an incredibly heavy, profoundly devastating psychological weapon that actively forces deeply insecure people to sit completely alone with their own massive, unhealed trauma. Take a massive, deep breath today. Completely detach from the chaotic, desperate need to be perfectly understood, and boldly reclaim the absolute steering wheel of your own powerful, beautiful emotional state. Let them loudly misunderstand you, let them unfairly judge your incredible journey, and let them completely drown in their own toxic, noisy drama while you quietly, peacefully build your massive, undeniable empire in the dark. Master your fragile emotions, radically embrace the incredibly intimidating power of the pause, and watch in absolute awe as the entire world suddenly violently shifts to give you the massive respect you have always truly deserved. If you found true value in this psychological lesson and learned something incredibly important about the undeniable power of silence today, please hit that like button, leave a comment below about your own journey, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life lessons.